Okay, so I'm pretty excited to make this video today. It's about SwiftUI previews and using them for non-SwiftUI apps. So right now I have an app that's rendering these previews using SwiftUI, even though the app itself supports back to iOS 11. So SwiftUI is only iOS 13, but your SwiftUI previews have nothing to do with your actual app. It's just rendering a preview of your code. So it's a really cool thing to be able to use. So instead of having to run your app, you can just preview your storyboard or your UIKit code and immediately see how it looks. And beyond that, you could send actual values in and see how your UI is reacting and sizing appropriately without ever running the app. So I found this to be super helpful to use, and I'll go through how to do that in a second. So to get started, I created a really basic app. It just has two labels and a profile image. This is all coming from the storyboard in here. Everything's auto layout, really basic. And the app itself supports back to iOS 11. And right now I'm running in simulator on an iPhone 8 with iOS 12, just to demonstrate that you could use SwiftUI previews even though your app doesn't support SwiftUI. So SwiftUI is iOS 13 and above, and we're going to use previews even though this app supports back to iOS 11. So I'm going to expand this out. Since we don't want to use the simulator anymore, we just want to use our previews in order to see our UI. Instead of having to run the app every time, the SwiftUI previews will let us just see our UI in real time and also give it fake values and long pieces of text just to see how our labels react and things like that. So to get started, we need to create a SwiftUI view, which I call view controller preview. So the trick is to conditionally import SwiftUI, and we'll also make it for debug builds only, just so that this won't ship with our actual app. So it'll get stripped out because it's debug only. And the way SwiftUI works is there's a bunch of bridging mechanisms between SwiftUI and UIKit, and one of them is view controller representable, which will just wrap a UIKit view controller and render it as a SwiftUI view. So in order to conform to this, we have to make a view controller. So in order to get this to work, we need to return a view controller in this make UI view controller function. And there's also an update function, but since this is only for previews, this will never actually be updating. We don't care about that. We just want to render it. So in order to return a view controller, we're going to supply one in initializers. So what we'll do is we'll use a generic type on this so that our view controller will allow us to, access its properties, which we'll see why in a second. So our first initializer is going to be if the view controller already exists, you just supply it and it'll set it. That one's super easy. And then the one for this tutorial that we're going to use is a little bit different since our view controller is coming from storyboard. So this initializer is going to take a storyboard identifier and a callback. And what this is going to allow us to do is load it from the storyboard, and then in the callback we'll be able to modify the view controller's properties before it gets rendered in the SwiftUI preview. We'll see why that is helpful in a second, but for now I'm just going to finish out this initializer. And since this is all debug code, we could just fatal error and not worry about it. There would be a message in the top of Xcode up here. It'll say like there's an error, and it should have something coming from the fatal error. I gotta make this a guard. And then once we set that, we're gonna also call our closure, which will allow us to configure the view controller before it renders. And then in our make UI view controller function, we're just going to return the view controller. And then we get this error saying it has to be iOS 13 or newer, which is fine because we're not actually ever calling this. So if we build now, everything works. So now let's create our previews. So in the view controller, we're going to do a similar thing where we do if can import SwiftUI. So the way SwiftUI previews work is with another struct. So we'll call this view controller. I think the standard way of doing this is whatever the name of your view or view controller is, and then underscore previews, and then you make it conform to preview provider. Preview provider, as soon as you do that, is going to render the canvas, and in order to conform to it, you have to supply the previews. So there's a variable, and what we'll do is add a group, which will allow us to have multiple previews in the canvas. For now, we're just going to do an empty text just to get this working. We get that same error as before, only iOS 13 or newer. So we'll take this and just apply it to the entire struct. Since we're never actually calling this code ourselves, we could put this at available since we're never actually accessing it. The Xcode itself is accessing it, so it's all good to go. So if I hit resume, it should just render this text object, which is right here. So now let's use our view controller preview that we just created. And we have the two initializers. If we had the view controller, we would just apply that. But since it's coming from storyboard, we'll use the other one. So it's coming from the main storyboard. The identifier is just view controller. And then here we get access to the view controller before it gets rendered. So immediately we see our storyboard is rendering in our preview, which is pretty cool, which in itself isn't that handy because it's not really any different than just looking at it in here. I mean, it does a little bit of styling, and which is nice, but the real power of this is that we could actually modify our labels and the image view and see what it'll look like. So for example, what I'm going to do is load the view if it needs. So we'll do load view if needed. And we do this because it's coming from storyboard. So if I was to access one of these IB outlets before the view loads, it'll crash. So as soon as the view is loaded, we know those outlets are hooked up. So if I do the name label.text, and I'll just set it to Spark code, we can now see that immediately. And similarly, we could do that with the bio label. And I'll make this, it's just something short for now. So this is kind of like a best case scenario where our text fits and everything looks pretty good. I'll also set the profile image just to make it look a little bit better. Sometimes you'll get this try again error, but most of the time it's not actually an error. In this case it is because I'm not setting the image. There we go. It works. And this is pretty cool. We could see exactly, what we're setting and how our UI looks, which in itself right now isn't very helpful, but what we could do is have multiple previews in different states. So if I do this, I could now try to add some longer text and see how the UI reacts. So if I do this, and then I'll change the bio. And we could see already that when the text is longer, it's not reacting very good. And we're not even running the app, so this is pretty cool to immediately see this. So if I go to the storyboard and just make some adjustments, and the reason why it's truncating is because of how my constraints are set up. So the bottom of this container view is to the bottom of the image view. So it's not going to ever be bigger than the image is. So if I just lower this priority to 750, it should allow it to grow longer now. Nope, 750 is still too high, so I'll lower it a little bit more. Let's try 700. Okay, it's still not going. Okay, there we go. So now our UI is actually running the amount of lines that it should without getting truncated. So this is super helpful, especially if you have like dependencies and other things you need to inject to make it work. And the other cool thing you could do is even setting like accessibility fonts and seeing how things will react. So for example, in SwiftUI, there's this concept of environments, and you could inject specific environments. So if I want to inject the size category and make it, to start, I'll do accessibility. And then our font grows bigger. And I could also, make the other one, I'll make this one small. And then this font is going to shrink. Or I can make this, extra large. And it gets bigger. So and we're not even running the app. So it's I've found it at least to be very helpful to prototype out UI without having to run the app and go to a specific screen. And there's a lot of really cool things you could do with your dependencies, because in a more complex app, you're going to have network requests going and all kinds of stuff. There's probably going to be, spinners in your UI, and if the request fails, you're going to show some failure UI, and if your request succeeds, it'll have some success UI. And in apps I've worked on, I've injected, fake networking, and then I could see, in the success case, it looks like this. In the failure case, it looks like this. And if the request hasn't come back, it shows, this spinner. So I found it to be really helpful. It's pretty cool to be able to use SwiftUI just as previews, even though the app itself is in UIKit. Having the power of SwiftUI makes it really easy to prototype your UIKit views and move a little bit quicker, just because with a storyboard, you're still pretty limited, but being able to see live previews is really helpful, I've found. So in a future videos, I'm definitely going to return to this concept, especially when I get more into, dependency injection and working with accessibility fonts. Being able to see previews without running the app is really helpful.